Hello and welcome to this Daily Journal webcast. I'm Chris Kiefer, managing editor for Multimedia, and I'm joined today by Ole Miss beat reporter Parrish Alford. Talking about a big story that Parrish has been covering, I guess for a couple of months now. But today was kind of maybe a little bit more clarity on the NCAA investigation into Ole Miss. I guess Parrish, tell me, this is the first time that you've gotten to finally actually see what the violations are, as well as Ole Miss released its response to those violations.
Well, we knew to some degree what the violations were because some of them had been released by the school. Some of them were released in conjunction with the Laramie Tunsil investigation last summer and fall. So we knew some of those, and that's a good thing because that means a lot of what's coming out today is not new news. It's not catching anybody off guard. You knew about the Tunsil violations. You knew about the loaner cars and some of those violations that are expressed early in the letter of allegations. So those things, while significant, have already been dealt with, and that's important because you look at the Laramie Tunsil situation from last summer, the altercation with his then stepfather, Lindsey Miller, and everything that came out of that. Ultimately, there was a 7-game suspension for Tunsil. All of those violations have been dealt with. The NCAA has been satisfied, for those particular violations because players are reinstated. And so you can see there some allegations of loaner cars and impermissible benefits that way for Tunsil, and also for C.J. Hampton, another player who was suspended and reinstated. So that part of the allegations have been dealt with, and there are a lot of those in this letter because a big part of this, and one of the most egregious acts would be the academic misconduct. Well, that deals with former assistants David Saunders and Chris Vaughn. That goes back to 2010. The Houston Nutt staff. Houston Nutt actually had a conversation with John Davis of our sister paper, the Oxford Citizen, several months ago, and Houston shed a little light on that. And he felt like he was a little bit misled by Chris Vaughn and David Saunders at that time. But ultimately he went on and continued the recruitment with a couple of these players. Two of them that come to mind during that time were Delvin Jones and Tony Grimes. Grimes, a Florida kid, a defensive back. Jones, I want to say he was from Illinois or somewhere, but he may also have been a Florida kid. But basically, those were two of the guys who Houston says were involved in the ACT exam at Wayne County High School. And that's a big part of what this letter is right now, and that's important because those things have already been dealt with. Now, some that have not been dealt with deal with Maurice Harris and Chris Kiffin, a couple of current assistant coaches, Derek Nix as well, and Matt Luke, 4 current assistant coaches named in these violations. Well, basically they have to do with recruiting. A lot of it has to do with a booster, Walter Hughes, out of Memphis. Impermissible benefits. When we say those words, a lot of times we're talking about transportation, lodging, things like that. The gist of it, in the matter of Kiffin and Harris, the school says basically they were misinformed or didn't get the compliance office involved quickly enough. I mean, they're boiling this down to what they say is not a big deal. And in the fact of Harris, the school goes so far as to say that it really disagrees with the NCAA enforcement staff's characterization of Harris's involvement in this alleged violations. Basically, Harris, for his part, thought that the relationship between Hughes and some prospects out of the Memphis area was permissible in the sense that Hughes is an FCA volunteer and had a previous relationship with these guys. So, there's a lot of gray area there, but those are some of the things that involve the current assistant coaches And basically, Ole Miss has boiled down this response, doesn't think it's major, and hopes that the NCAA agrees.
So I guess kind of for people who haven't really gotten into a lot of the details yet, kind of walk us through. It goes through, I guess it's 3 sports that they're looking at. I'm trying to find it. 16 level 1 violations.
28 violations total. Yeah, 16 level 1. There are 13 violations in football. A couple of those level 1 violations, one has to do with women's basketball, and so they're spread out a little bit there. Basically, there are 13 violations with football, and it remains to be seen. The next step here is what will the NCAA say with the Ole Miss response? And there's the new twist here, Chris,
Mm-hmm.
of the latest Tunsil saga. We go back to draft night, April 28th. Tunsil, the social media accounts were hacked. The conversation appears with Instagram photos that are between Tunsil and football operations John Miller. Tunsil was asking for money for his mother's rent. Basically, none of what the public was seeing for the first time that night was a surprise for the NCAA. The NCAA, I'm told, knew about this, had already dealt with this and moved on. However, because of how that story took on a new twist and came to light in a very public manner, the NCAA has come back and has asked more questions about that and has kind of reopened that element of the investigation. And you could see in Ross Bjork's open letter to the community, that letter signed by Bjork and Chancellor David Vitter, you could see where Bjork has, in essence, asked the Committee on Infractions to move the Ole Miss case back, to move the hearing back, to not set a date for an Ole Miss hearing until the current matter involving Tunsil and the draft night comments has been completed and is closed. Before all that, in conversations I was having with Ross Bjork before the draft, he was really hopeful that the whole NCAA matter would come to a close sometime this summer. Right now, it looks like it's still on go for an indefinite period of time. NCAA investigations are a lot of things, but they are not fast.
Sure.
So they're looking at this Tunsil matter. The feeling from the Ole Miss camp is that they're going to be okay here. They're going to rely on the Student Assistance Fund. I mean, that's a fund that the NCAA has set up to allow for emergencies for its student athletes. It's administered by the conferences. So in this case, the SEC is involved. And it's not, a lot of people look at that and they think, well, rent every month, is that an emergency? Well, the way that fund is set up, it gives schools and conferences a great deal of latitude in determining how to distribute those funds. So could it have been used to pay for his mother's rent? Yes. Could it have been used more than once? Yes. The way that fund is defined and how it is set up, great deal of latitude for schools and conferences to help student athletes. Ole Miss believes that they have the documentation to prove that with the NCAA. But as long as the NCAA is investigating this, Bjork today in the letter noted that he has asked that the entire NCAA investigation be delayed, that a hearing for Ole Miss before the Committee on Infractions be moved back.
So I guess the first thing, as far as the timeline, will be the NCAA will rule on whether or not they'll just go forward or will delay it. I guess that's kind of the next step in the process.
Well, my guess is that they would just honor that request. I don't think there will be a big date on the calendar for that. I think they will honor that request, and I think that this investigation will continue. I think it'll be quiet for a while. A lot of news coming out today, but I think I don't think you're going to see anything else on this until the NCAA says it has completed its second look into the Tunsil situation. And when that happens, I think then you'll be able to put a date on the calendar for a hearing before the Committee on Infractions. And at that point, the committee will announce if it has accepted Ole Miss's self-imposed penalties, if it's going to add to those penalties and what that might be. And Ole Miss will decide if it is finished or if it will appeal the NCAA's findings.
I guess tell us a little bit more about those self-imposed penalties. I know I saw some scholarship reductions for football. Is that kind of the biggest part of it?
Yeah, I didn't see an exact number in that response. They referred to it as double-digit scholarship reductions, which I think is significant.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see if that's enough for the NCAA. I think that Ole Miss has worked hard to penalize itself, sanction itself on the heavy end, with hopes that what it's done will stand.
Mm-hmm.
The big thing here, Chris, is you really want to try to avoid a postseason ban. Any sort of this is a team with high expectations in 2016, a team that certainly could put itself in position to contend in the SEC West if they answer some questions along the offensive line. They lost a lot of talent, with Tunsil, Laquan Treadwell, Robert Condici, but they have a lot of talent returning. And if they can get some good play along the offensive line, answer some questions there, this is a team that could once again be in the mix for the playoffs, a New Year's Six bowl game, that sort of thing. You do not want any sort of postseason ban standing in the way of that.
Yeah, will any of this mean anything? Could it mean anything for this football season, or are we kind of looking at a timeline that that by the time anything comes out, it'll be well beyond the upcoming season?
It's possible that a ruling could come down during the season. And I would think that it would be my guess that if there was going to be a postseason ban, it would be for the immediate, the next season or the season in play.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't think it's going to come to that. I just don't believe that that is going to be among any additional sanctions. We'll see. But in theory, it could. It absolutely could impact the current season, the 2016 season.
So I was going to ask about sanctions and whether, you thought there were likely to be heavier sanctions. I mean, you mentioned, I know scholarship reduction, football coaches will tell you is a heavy sanction, but whether it be a postseason ban or anything else, I mean, what do you think the NCAA is likely to do? Are they likely to accept this, or are there likely to be more penalties and heavy penalties coming?
I think they are likely to accept this. I think double-digit scholarship reductions, I think that's a big penalty that Ole Miss has self-imposed.
And just on that point, Parrish, that is double-digit over a number of years, or is that for 1 year?
I think that would be over a number of years.
Okay.
But that would be a total.
Mm-hmm.
The
sure.
Would be
3 or 4 year over 3 years or something.
Might be over a period of several years.
Mm-hmm.
And the school has already started working, to manage that to a degree. I mean, Hugh Freeze did not use all of his available scholarships in the 2016 class. So, they're looking at that. They have an eye on that. They know something's coming, and they've already begun to work at managing that.
And then I guess we've kind of talked about the next step in the process is just kind of waiting to see what happens with the rest of the Tunsil investigation. How will that word, do you think, come out? Will the NCAA release findings, or kind of what would happen? How will people get that news?
The NCAA doesn't release anything in that regard, and it will be quiet, and it will just be it will depend on whether Ole Miss chooses to say the investigation is now complete, and if Ole Miss announces a date for a hearing before the NCAA Committee on Infractions. So, what I tell people all the time is when there's no information, there's speculation, and I think you'll have a lot of that in the weeks and months to come.
Obviously you led your story with the fact that one of the biggest things is the 4 current coaches. Although some of it was coaches, as you mentioned, under the Houston Nutt era, but there were 4 current coaches involved. The school, as you said, defended them in their investigation, but do you expect there to be some sort of penalty of those coaches, or could any of them lose their jobs over this, or what are you thinking may happen in that case?
I'm thinking that none of these four assistant coaches lose a job over this, because two of them have already been penalized and admonished by the university, have been disciplined by the school for not doing enough to bring compliance into the matter, for not knowing enough, or what have you. The response from the school did not indicate malice on the part of the coaches, but it did indicate responsibility. They felt like Chris Kiffin and Maurice Harris, when they didn't know something, didn't ask enough questions, didn't bring compliance into the picture quickly enough. Those were the primary criticisms of those two coaches, and they both were disciplined by the school.
What about and obviously the biggest interest is on football, and I'm sure that's where you spent most of your time. Looking at, have you had a chance to look much at the women's track the track and the women's basketball stuff? And is that are those violation sanctions even more significant?
Well, I have not looked a great deal at the track. But the track end of it is interesting, because the coach who was, as the response said, there was a mutual agree of resignation, a mutual agreement for him to resign. Well, that was Brian O'Neill, former Pontotoc high school star, really likable person, good guy that I've gotten to know through the years. I don't know exactly what his involvement was, but it was mutually agreed that he would resign as track coach. And the women's basketball issue really kind of put this whole investigation on the forefront back in the fall of 2012, when Adrian Wiggins had not long been named head coach. Ross Bjork had not long been named athletics director. And there was the academic misconduct scandal there that involved two assistant coaches. It was judged at the time that Adrian Wiggins did not know that these things had gone on without his knowledge, but the fact that he didn't know was enough to cost him his job. So he was held accountable there, and actions were taken in the program at that time. And part of the sanctions there included a postseason ban. So, there are scholarship cuts and other things there that have made rebuilding a little more difficult, and that's a challenge that Matt Insel is facing right now. But that's the gist of the problems in the other two sports.
Sure. Anything, Parrish, that we haven't touched on yet that that's important to look at or to make note of?
Well, I'll tell you, there's so much there, Chris. So much to process and to look at and think about, and it's difficult to do that in a small window of time. So I'm sure that we've missed something. It's the kind of thing that you keep looking at, and sometimes you look at it a second time and it looks a little different than it did the first time. Lots of information there, and it's not presented in a very easy to understand manner. Too long documents.
Sure.
So they're just lots of information, but it's available for everyone to see.
Sure, and obviously it's something that you'll be continuing to cover, and so as kind of you have time to look at more of it and see it more, people can keep following your stuff at djournal.com, Inside Ole Miss Sports Blog, of course the double coverage podcast that you and Logan do. I'm sure it'll be a topic going forward, and so as you have more time to digest and look at it, that information will be available for people to follow. And obviously in tomorrow's paper, you'll have stuff there. So you thought you were in Hoover to cover baseball, and always something else going on, Parrish.
Well, I will tell you, Chris, I knew that this was coming, so I've been on top of it and prepared to just kind of clear the calendar and push a lot of stuff to the side when it did come out. Now, going backward on the calendar a little bit, I was with my family in Destin last weekend. We did not cover the baseball series at Texas A&M. We kind of looked at our family calendar, and we had about 3 days for the whole summer where all four of us were going to be together.
Sure.
And so we were down in Destin, and I was communicating with Kyle Campbell, the Associate Athletics Director for Media Relations. And I'm saying, Kyle, man, tell me that this is not going to be released on May 21, 22, or 23. You tell me that I'm okay for those 3 days. And he told me that I would be okay. And we discovered that this information was going to be released at some point during this week.
Sure.
And as often the case for big information, you kind of do that on a Friday. I think that's a news cycle thing that people learn about in public relations. Chris, I kind of thought that they pushed the button on this when the Baylor stuff was coming out yesterday. But,
yeah.
Kind of share that news cycle.
Sure. Yeah, I guess so. That's kind of how it goes sometimes. Well, thanks, Parrish. We appreciate your time. Appreciate everyone for watching. And again, you can continue to follow Parrish's coverage of this story at thejournal.com.